Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar all about Gen AI and especially 5 things you need to know about Gen AI for tech professionals. My name is Rien Kamphuis. I will be a moderator for today. I work with UI and I am in text technology, but I should probably limit it to text for today. But the most interesting stuff will come from our panelists, and you can see the speakers here on screen. I'll start with Boris. Boris is the founder of Arm's Length AI. That's a AI-driven solution that helps transfer pricing professionals to complete their tasks with the help of AI, of course, saving time. And I can imagine he will talk a bit about that as well. We have Bart. Bart is the CTO and founder of Loctax. He has a lot of experience in AI and machine learning, and he has applied AI technologies already in sports. And he has contributed to AI-driven initiatives in a startup from Unilever. And then last but not least, we have Frank, also works at EY. He's a colleague, senior manager and responsible for EY's innovation and also helping with innovation at clients. And of course, recently, Frank is particularly involved in everything in relation to AI. So I'd like to hear from you as well. We'll have a couple of topics, of course, 5 things that you need to know. We'll talk about these 5 things, and maybe if we have some other, a bit of extra time, we'll talk about potentially some of the misconceptions about Gen AI as well. But if you have any questions for our panelists today throughout the webinar, feel free to type in your question, and then we'll see how and whether we can address those in some of the topics that come up during this webinar. Let's try to keep it as interactive as possible. So the agenda for today, five things. I'll quickly run through it, but the way that we set this up is that for each of those 5 topics, we have a number of questions, and then our panelists will take us through these topics. So very quickly, first we'll do a bit of setting the scene about what Gen AI is. Then we'll go into some real world applications. So what is AI good at? And then especially in relation to text, of course, but also talk a little bit about the technological limitations. And then we'll talk about the human factor. The big question is, will it take over from a tax consultant, our advisory work, or tax professional compliance work or reporting work as well? And that does have an impact on people that are just starting their career in tax. And then we'll talk a bit about the risks associated with Gen AI, and then we'll talk more about what can you actually do in terms of next steps. And of course, then if we have some more time or questions, we'll go into those or talk about the misconceptions. So let's talk about what Gen AI is. So I would like to hand over to Boris. Boris, maybe you can take us through that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. Let's start with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really an umbrella term for many things. There are things like automatic door opening. You can say this is AI. You can say that car autopilot is using AI technologies. AI was used traditionally for analyzing large volumes of data, and we know social media algorithms are using AI to show you the best content that you will engage with. Those are all forms of artificial intelligence based usually on machine learning algorithms. But the specific form of AI that everyone are talking about nowadays is generative AI. So generative AI is a set of AI models and algorithms which are generating new content based on the content that it was trained on. So it's replicating what it was trained for in various other scenarios. So for example, generative AI is used to create images nowadays. So we have models like DALL-E, Midjourney, and a few others, where you can go and ask AI to create some particular picture, and then it will usually create a very good image whenever you need to use it. However, for tax, and I would say for finance, broadly speaking, the main form of generative AI, or the main set of AI models that are especially useful, is text generative AI. And everyone knows about ChatGPT. So that's the most popular application that uses text generative AI. And the reason why it is especially relevant for tax is that our profession is centered around regulations, narratives, and stories. So in contrast to many other professions, ours is really grounded in text. Text as an area is a form of law, and law is a text. And generative AI and models like GPT are especially good at working with concepts and text. So in transfer pricing, for example, our favorite book is OECD Guidelines, 600 pages complex text, and GPT knows it much better than most of the people and even most of transfer pricing specialists, it seems. Of course, numbers are also involved in our profession, obviously, but still the concepts and principles are narrative driven. In this sense, that's the reason why we wanted to talk about generative AI today, because it is especially relevant for tax profession. It is a new technology, or it became popular and well-known relatively recently. And that's the reason why we're talking about it today.
Thanks, Boris. Very helpful to set the scene a bit on what Gen AI is. Let's dive into it. Already now focusing on tax. What tax-related tasks is Gen AI specifically good at? Frank, I know that you are working on a lot of use cases. So can you name a few and inspire us on what you're working on?
Yeah, so this is the question that's on everybody's mind, right? What is it good at? And to answer this question, we did an experiment in the Netherlands, and I asked a number of colleagues to give me a number of tax tasks, so tax-specific tasks. And I asked it from colleagues in the direct tax department, international tax, payroll tax, indirect tax, transfer pricing, everybody. And they all gave me tasks, and the tasks were generating content, summarizing foreign tax news alerts, classification of costs for VAT or for payroll, summarizing very long OECD documents, and also researching some income tax questions. And so I received a lot of questions, and I put them all in GPT and answered them. And then I asked all the submitters to review the output from GPT. And that came with a very interesting conclusions. First of all, one of the quotes from one of the participants was, I think if I remember correctly, it's, I think I can now retire early. I can forward this output one-on-one to a client. But there was also another participant that said the AI uses the right terminology, but completely in the wrong context. So it's a jack of all trades, but a master of none in that sense. And if we take a look at what type of task it was really good at, it scored really high, I think 87% on tax compliance related tasks. So these were more routine email generation, letter generation, and it scored worst, I think 59% on transfer pricing related tasks and research related tasks. And I think that's really interesting. Also, if we look at what it was really good at, summarizing, it summarized text alerts better than a human would, and it was worse at research because it also hallucinated some sources, so we really couldn't forward the output to a client. So I think for me, if we take a look at the question, what is GenAI really good at in text? For now, I see the routine text tasks like generating emails, generating letters, summarizing, translating. And that's also what Microsoft Copilot that will be launched soon is all about. So really an AI that looks over our shoulder and helps us with daily tasks. I think what we also see already happening is chatbots augmented with text-specific knowledge. So then we really have an AI that can answer in a natural way text questions. But I think generating real specialist text deliverables and having a proactive text advisor AI, I think we're still a bit far away from that. But the impact, especially in the automation and routine tasks, I think that's really high for me. So that would be my summary.
Interesting. And you mentioned it was a little bit worse, maybe not worse is the right word, but less good in transfer pricing. Boris, you are working in this space. Would you agree with Frank, or do you have a different perspective?
No, I actually agree with Frank. I think transfer pricing is indeed a pretty complex area of international tax because it's based on economic substance and a lot of business facts that you need to take into account. So the context that you need to provide to get a good result is usually pretty big. And it makes it more interesting because you need to set the model in the right form. You need to provide it the right amount of information around and the right amount of data and the right context. And once you've done that, the result and the quality of the result is very high. However, it's very difficult to get high quality result by just like prompting ChatGPT with a question or two that are business or case specific. That's true. And that's the reason why I'm working in this area, actually, because I'm not expecting people to use traditional or generic tools like ChatGPT for those tasks. because the output will not be good. So we need more specialized tools, which are built, of course, on top of the same models, but more tailored to those cases, though it's still possible. But there are also like additional use case, which is transfer pricing has it, but VAT and direct tax also have a lot of those tasks as classifications. In transfer pricing, we do those benchmarking studies. You have a set of companies and you need to say if they are good or not as comparables based on certain criteria. So ChatGPT, for example, or GPT as a model is very good at doing that. And I assume that in VAT, customs, direct tax, you could also start classifying things which are huge amounts of transactions, for example, using generative AI. It was possible already with previous generation of AI technologies, but with generative AI, it's now much cheaper and faster to do.
Thanks, Boris. One of the questions that I often hear as well, whether GenAI can play a role, is contextualizing data. So linking data of one source with another and maybe give some context to it or relationships between the data. So I will ask a question on that later on. But before we move to that, perhaps another question here, not only that the possibilities for text, but also the limitations. Bart, can you talk a little bit about the limitations of GenAI that we need to take into account?
Yeah, sure. When we're speaking about limitations of generative AI, it's important to note that this field is accelerating so rapidly that while I speak about it, it's already outdated information. That being said, I think a general misconception that lives is that generative AI has become a general intelligence, which it most definitely is not. So I think one of the biggest limitations is the underlying algorithm doesn't actually understand what you're saying. In fact, it just uses statistics behind the scenes to predict the next best possible token. And it uses your input as criteria to predict those tokens. That being said, generative AI is still very early days. This is not going anywhere. And I think the technical limitations that are currently there, like the context window limitations and so forth, they will all be gone relatively quickly. There is a future that I can already see where the interface that we're now getting used to will become the standard new user face. Think transformation from Microsoft DOS to Windows. I think generative AI will be augmented with traditional machine learning models and APIs, similar to what OpenAI is already doing. And then we will jump light years ahead. To give you an idea, generative AI is extremely bad at math, but introduce a plugin that is very good at math and understanding math and utilizing that plugin to feed it in a contextualized fashion, it becomes extremely good at both things. Technical limitations, very difficult to talk about. If there is one thing that I would like to highlight, it's roles and permissions. So controlling what data is exposed to which individual. I think that's still very much a technical limitation that I don't see solved in the immediate term. Definitely, if you think about training your own embeddings on top of generative AI, contextualizing them to an individual, we have invested an enormous amount of time in building roles and permission restrictions over at Loctax, specifically because as soon as you deal with very sensitive data, exposing it to the people that it only should be exposed to, it becomes critical. And I think their generative AI is not equipped to deal with it.
Hey, and Bart, but if you're an optimist, I would rephrase based on everything that you said. What are currently the important technological challenges? But I would think that we would be able to overcome those and link those. Would you see it the same way?
Of course, I think if you look at Microsoft's semantic kernel, they are already evolving in what I just highlighted, where the generative AI part is just the top layer and it integrates with multiple systems, APIs, you name it, machine learning models. And this is early days. I have no idea where this evolution will go. And honestly, I don't think any of us can predict where this is going to go. It's probably going to exceed anyone's expectations and imagination. This is one more thing that I want to say about technological limitations. I think it is critical for any organization to still think about traditional machine learning and artificial intelligence in the sense that you still need good training data in order to build on top of generative AI. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon, especially if you want to build contextual models to your organization. You still need a source of information because the rule still applies here: garbage in, garbage out.
Okay, thanks, Bart. So let's move on to the next topic, which is the human factor. This is an anecdote of what we already see happening in our organization. So we already have a few clients that are using ChatGPT as well. They send an output of what they ask ChatGPT, and they ask us as a text consultant to verify whether the answer that ChatGPT generated, whether that's the right answer. But I don't want to steal your thunder, Boris and Frank. So Boris, first over to you. Will GenAI take over advisory and compliance work, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, the example that you provided, because I think that may be the future of our profession, where AI will be generating a lot of things and we will be just verifying them. But the short answer to the question is we probably don't know at this point of time. As Bart said, it may exceed our expectations. It already exceeded our expectations, I think, a lot. So I ran a survey a year ago, once ChatGPT was, the first version, 3.5, was live, and running a few experiments on transfer pricing, and obviously the results were not great. But then I ran a survey among transfer pricing people asking, like, in how many years do you think it will be able to provide the advice? And I clearly defined what type of advice that would be by providing the professional certification exam question and asking, like, in how many years do you think it will be able to provide right answer to this type of questions? And the average was like 5 years, but there were a lot of people who said it will never do it. And then once GPT-4 was live, it was already able to provide that type of advice correctly. So I think it's like the expectations that we have maybe are getting outdated very fast. But if the technology develops with the same pace as it does now, I think the answer is yes. So we will be at some point replaced in terms of advisory and compliance work. But coming back to what Sam Altman, the founder of company behind ChatGPT, said, when he founded this company, he thought that AI will come after labor-intensive jobs first, like factory workers and drivers. And then the second point, he thought that AI will replace certain jobs. But what we see in reality is AI came after creative and white-collar jobs, with designers and writers being at the highest risk. AI is not even close to replacing humans in jobs, but it's close in replacing humans in many tasks that they have in their jobs. So that's how we should think about, like, how many tasks AI nowadays can replace or substantially automate. And coming back to our analogy with construction worker, for example, the modern construction site requires 16 different machines on site to construct the building. And then each of that machines technically replace really a lot of construction workers who in other case would be needed to do the work that the machine is doing. And is it possible to do this work without this machine? Yes, because we have pyramids and Colosseum, but it would probably take much more time, or wouldn't even be possible realistically. So that's how we should think about that. AI will provide us with a lot of those machines that will make our work much more effective, to a degree where maybe one person will be able to produce the output of 5 people today, right? So that's how I would think about that. I think we're very far from full replacement, but we're close to seeing very substantial bump in our productivity. If you look at Boston Consulting Group, they run a very good survey. They've seen an improvement from 20 to 50% in terms of time, quality, and other parameters in terms of their consultants' output. So that's what we can see already today. And that was just ChatGPT.
Thanks, Boris. GenAI will not take over jobs, but it will remove tasks, right? And Frank, what is your perspective on that? That will mean that the tax profession needs to reinvent itself, right?
So let me start by also referencing BCG study, which I think was 750 consultants, pretty broad study. I think half of them got GPT-4 and were like, please use it for everything. And the other half were like prohibited of using it. And I think, Boris, that you said, like, huge improvement in efficiency. But what also came from that study, which I found interesting, was it's a 40% gain in innovation and creative jobs. But the group that relied on GPT scored 23% less or worse on business problem solving. I think that's a key point of why AI won't take over on the short term. So if you rely on AI, you are 23% worse at business problem solving. And I think, I hope that our job still is a lot of business problem solving. And also what's an important point of our job that people sometimes overlook, there's this website, I don't know the exact URL, but I think it's riskofautomation.com or something. And for various jobs, it basically describes the risk of automation. And I think if you look at text preparation, I think it says something like an imminent risk of automation, 93%. 93%, that's pretty high. Although the 7% that cannot be automated, that's the human factor. So that's sitting down with a client, watching the micro expressions in their face, knowing when to ask a smart follow-up question. I think that human element will also in the near future, so the coming years, still be an important part. So if you ask me, I think, will GenAI take over tax advisory and compliance work? There's this good quote, I think it's from Benjamin Allery, and it's, AI will not take over our tax jobs, but tax advisors that use AI will replace tax advisors who don't. So I think that's in line, Boris, with what you said. So it will automate tasks, but will not automate away people.
But the definite conclusion of what you're both saying is that it will certainly become an integral part of our day-to-day work, right? It's regardless of whether you're more on the consultant side or the in-house tax professional side. Okay, interesting. But then the next question, how are we going to develop younger people? So people that will come from university and they just leave learning on a day-to-day basis and they start to work. How are they going to develop themselves so that they can become a similar tax professional that many of the people here in the audience are today? Again, Boris, can you take the lead on this?
Yeah, I think the point which you raised there is very important. I think the underlying trend that we also know about is it's getting more difficult to get junior people and interns in tax and finance profession over time. And there are several factors to it, from tax or finance broadly was a desired profession 10 years and 20 years ago. Nowadays, it's more about machine learning, IT, AI, and other factors. So just less people go to university to study finance now. People are changing their profession much more often. And it's becoming more difficult to keep people in their jobs also. It affects all the professional service sector. It's relevant for all the economy and the professional sector specifically. And I think AI is actually acting as a savior in some way here, because AI is especially good at doing tasks that junior people traditionally were doing well. So I think in this regard, we have this gap in workforce that is forming and maybe expanding over time. We don't know. Of course, there are micro trends, and even demographics is playing the negative side here. But AI will help businesses to get a little bit more labor effectively, or human equivalent labor there. At the same time, I think what is also important is that from that same Boston Consulting Group study, which I think is the only that level of study that we can refer to at this point, AI also gets a specifically big bump in performance for junior colleagues. So less experienced people benefit from AI much more than more experienced people for the same set of tasks. So what you can also expect is that junior guys will be doing better jobs, which is also pretty natural because they can have this assistant that is like a senior sitting next to them on some tasks. Another trend that we will see is that AI will be a democratizer of knowledge, basically, because when I start asking it transfer pricing related questions, it gives me very good answers, which when I've done my research and was writing a textbook 3 years ago, I had a very hard time finding information on the internet for those questions. Now you can go to ChatGPT and it will give you very good answers to your transfer pricing questions if you want to learn the field. So that makes it especially useful for personal development and for professional development. The other side of the same benefit is that how do you motivate people to learn something if the machine always knows the answer better and can write it better? I think that's a fundamental question which we will see not only for tax but for any other field. And the other side of that problem is, how do you know that the person that you're asking question provides the answer himself or herself, and this person is not just a good ChatGPT user, right? How do you know that your tax advisor actually knows transfer pricing or Dutch tax? and not just a good ChatGPT user? Those are the questions which we don't know answers to, but I think humanity and civilization will have to find answers to those, because those are pretty fundamental.
Yeah, I think they're great points. Frank, maybe your perspective on this. I don't want to put you on the spot, but some of these I think you've already thought about.
Yes, a lot of thinking, not a lot of outcomes. I think if you look at where you need to be as a tax advisor in a few years, is you need to be able to review the output of an LLM and be able to know what it doesn't know and spot where it's missing something. And I think what I already see happening, and especially I have interns that do this, every question I ask them, they initially run through 3 LLMs and then they combine the output. And usually it gets like really creative answers. So I'm happy with the output, but it's missing some of the experience that usually the people that really dove into all the parliamentary history can get out of it. So they actually
Again,
get
very quick.
more.
Why would you use 3 instead of 1?
Oh, they use multiple so they can get the best answers and use the benefits of each. But one of the questions that came up, should we ban the access to those chatbots for consultants so they can really take the first few years of their career to dive into the parliamentary history and all read it? And I think the answer is no, we're not going to do it. And I also think it's not possible to ban access because there's always ways around. But there's a lot of education to be done to make, I think, aware of the risk of only relying on a large language model or a ChatGPT to answer questions. I think if I was a consultant, I would focus really a lot on also doing the research myself, because that's ultimately what makes you valuable as an experienced tax advisor. It's also what our clients more and more expect from us, to be a super specialist and be able to review the output from an LLM. And that's the question, Rink, you said we already get as well.
Okay, thanks, Frank. So let's move on. You already talked a bit about the risks here as well. So let's go to the next topic and question of what are the risks associated with if you use GenAI for tax-related tasks? And some of them were already mentioned just now, but maybe Bart, you have a perspective on this as well?
Yes. I think there are still a lot of things that we need to discover. For instance, there was quite a bit of rise up in several creative worlds where generative AI was taking away jobs and people were scared of their work. I think one of the key questions that I have in my head is, what if the tax authorities demand you to disclose that you have used generative AI in your work? I think that's a very key risk. Another one, obviously, is liability. Who's liable for the output of generative AI? Is it the person that prompted it and consumed it? Is it the model on which it was trained? I think there are a lot of question marks and risks associated with the usage of generative AI. And like I said before, it's still early days. Who knows what the regulators across the world will do to the usage and the application of generative AI. Hallucinations, those are frequent and pretty standard part of generative AI. For the people that don't know what hallucinations are, it's the algorithm that's actually just making things up based off of its training data. Another big risk I see is there is a constant change in laws and regulation, and the responses of a generative AI are only as good as its training data. And today it's already lacking accuracy, but if it hasn't been trained on that data as a foundational model, so OpenAI, I think the alternative there is that either you provide your own training set to work on top of it that incorporates these new laws and regulations if you want to use them in your daily work, or you need to wait until it actually has been trained to incorporate these new changes. That's also where the new people in the tax field might run into issues, because generative AI is not optimized for the tax field. Underlying technology might take the wrong input tokens as important in order to generate its response. I think a lot of it boils down to fine-tuning these things. For instance, I know Boris is doing with this product. Out of the box, there's a lot of risks associated with using it. And I think you need to fine-tune it in order to actually use it in your daily line of work.
Boris or Frank, anything to add on what Bart just mentioned?
I think maybe very quickly, we already see this happening. I think it was in the US that there was a lawyer that submitted court documents and there were like a lot of hallucinated sources in that documentation. And I think they even got a fine for doing so. It wasn't very high. I think it was $5,000 in dollar. but still, and I don't know if they won the case or lost the case, but it was a good example where there was like hallucination in a deliverable that was really important. And I think that's where, for me, the biggest fear is currently, because also sometimes it hallucinates sources when I ask it to do something, and it seems very plausible. So it does like the whole sourcing, right? It's a plausible date, it's a plausible article title, it's a plausible author, but they didn't say it or didn't say it yet. So maybe there's like a predictive analysis.
So is that sort of, because from a society perspective, we have obviously the fake news, being able to distinguish between actual news and fake news. But this is fake news on steroids, right? Because if ChatGPT comes up with it, but it's that issue that also is going to be relevant here. Okay, thanks. Shall we move on to a little bit more practical information of what can you do now? And there were already some of the questions, are there tools available and things like that? So maybe everybody can talk a bit about that as well. So as a text professional, what can you now actually do, make it practical in order to prepare for GenAI? So Frank, can I start with you?
Of course. So if I would need to list one thing, there are several things you can do, but if I would need to list one thing, it's go do a course on something called prompt engineering, which is a way to get the best output from the chatbot you're interfacing with. So it's a number of techniques that you can apply as smart ways to phrase your question, also from a text perspective. And I think the experiment we ran in the NEL, so the mini experiment with text deliverables, we recently reran part of that experiment and then applied prompt engineering to the previous questions. And then I think the output was like 33% better than in the initial run. So I think applying prompt engineering and making your questions better, that's really something I would study in the short run, because you will get a lot of value from that.
Thanks, Frank. Boris?
Yeah, I think what Frank said is very important. I think like you just need to be open-minded and positive about this. I think this technology will make our professional life better, ultimately, and more interesting and more enjoyable. But indeed, prompt engineering is one thing. The other thing is that it's not enough just to know that there is such a model and it's capable of doing various things. ChatGPT can do this, can do that. What I tend to see people doing, they go there and they ask it a question, never used before, ask a question, what is transfer pricing? What are the methods? And then it gives the answer. And then the answer may be good. And then, okay, but I knew that already. And they close and then they go around their business and continue doing things. What you really need to start doing, you need to start trying your daily tasks with it. Something what Frank discussed or explained what you are guys doing there. You have your tasks there. You need to write an email, you need to draft something, you need to analyze something. Before you just jump into doing it yourself, try doing it with ChatGPT and see if it works. Some things will work, some things will not, but over the couple of months of trying it, you will be very good at understanding like where it can bring value and where it will not. And this way you will become more productive and start enjoying it more, at the same time not creating a lot of friction. And I think the last thing that I would mention is there is already new technology around generative AI and text, like arm's length AI is for transfer pricing professionals, and there will be more and more technologies which are built specifically for text using generative AI. Just follow those, see what's coming, see what's available there, and just be open-minded and look at all the new technologies there or solutions that will be coming up there, because some of them will be definitely useful for you. And the last one, at the company level, you also need to raise this, because I've heard about firms that are forbidding using it, and at the same time I heard firms that are just like silent and everyone does whatever they want. If you're in the executive position, go there and initiate the conversation, if you haven't had it already, to form some approach, form some policy. And you can, of course, be extremely conservative there, say, we forbid it and that's all. Or be very open-minded and start running internal competitions and research on how we can use it. But being proactive and thoughtful about this is very important.
Thanks, Boris. And Bart, what's your most important thing to prepare for GenAI as a text professional?
Start structuring your data. Buy Loctax. No, just kidding. No, but seriously, I cannot say this enough. I think the revolution is coming, and if you want to contextualize this technology to your organization using your data, you need to have the data ready, lying on the shelf, or you're going to get nowhere. So the best advice, start centralizing your data, labeling it, prepare it for building models.
I think it's a very good point, which is not focused on GenAI as such, but if you look at text compared to finance, I think everybody can agree in general that the data that we produce as tax professionals is still a bit dispersed. And if we can somehow make a better structure around that, I was talking the other day to a company that was working on a proof of concept for using AI and also GenAI to show what potentially can work. And one of the examples that they gave is if I have tax compliance and if I have all of my data around all of my tax compliance in a location, centralized location, but I also have all of my HR information in location, then if you're able to connect that and GenAI, you can, for example, ask the question, can you please give me an overview of all of the countries and legal entities where I was too late in my 2022 tax return, and make a correlation with the sickness days that people took that they were responsible for that particular tax return. Just to show you how to bring together tax compliance information and HR information. And if you think about that, it requires a lot of data centralization, but then I think the potential is limitless. One question though, you have ChatGPT, but what are products and services, etc., or how is there something that is in terms of tooling available or going to be available? So I don't want to put emphasis on, let's say, Loctax or EY, what we're producing, but in general, would we see solutions being developed specifically on GenAI that you can put as on top of everything that you already use, or will it be embedded in all of the technology solutions that are already out there? Maybe Frank, can I ask you that question?
I think the funny thing is Gartner said something about this, which I think from the top of my head is in 2025, 40% of enterprise applications will have some form of GenAI chatbot embedded in them. So I think that's the first thing we'll probably see. So I think one, in all the enterprise apps and tax apps, there will be an LLM or a chatbot embedded. And then next to that, we probably have the more general ChatGPTs, Bing Enterprise, et cetera, and then we need to augment those with text knowledge and train them or fine-tune them to produce text deliverables. So that's where I see it going. But I think Gartner said it well, 40% of apps will have a chatbot next or in 1.5 years, approximately.
Any other perspectives from Boris or Bart on this one?
I think my experience applying generative AI to very specialized text areas suggests that you don't really need specialized AI model to do the tasks. What you need is the right context and maybe sometimes fine-tuning of a standard generalized model for vast majority of the tasks. So this way, I think that GPT-4 and the following models will still dominate the field. So that's why investing into your understanding of how they work and trying them early really make a lot of sense. Don't wait for anything specialized for your field. Try ChatGPT and then try specialized solutions as soon as they appear. I think that would be my advice on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the moat between OpenAI and the other competitors is very big. I think if there's any tool you need to be testing and using right now, it's ChatGPT. There are new tools appearing on the horizon. Recently, I saw a generative AI startup that was aiming to capture all UK legislation and transform that into a chatbot specifically tailored for the UK market. I think these kinds of examples, they will start appearing more and more and more. The question obviously is who will win the race to deliver the first product in these categories. I think we will have to wait and see.
And ultimately, how ChatGPT does this, at least for the Plus users, is they have this system called plugins, whereby you can basically give ChatGPT access to some part of knowledge outside itself. So this can be, for instance, Booking.com, Kayak, Expedia to book your travel. It can be Wikipedia. It can be a calculator. It can be something to make slides or sheets or whatever. Ultimately, where you also could see this going is that nobody wants like 5 interfaces, chat interfaces to work with all day, right? So you want one that has access to everything you need. So almost view this as one master, one that's like the orchestrator for everything you need to do. And let's say you have a startup that's specifically very good at UK legislation, then perhaps they become a plugin into a main ChatGPT instance somewhere. So that might be a very powerful way to look at the future.
And that contextualizing, that's all in an LLM.
Yes. So what happens, let's say the Kluwer example is one that's put in the Q&A. So what could be done with Kluwer is that somebody asks a question in ChatGPT, they enable the Kluwer plugin, and ChatGPT sends the question to Kluwer, takes back the top 10 results and formulates that into a knowledgeable answer. I think that's usually how that process is done.
Okay, so I would want to ask each of the panelists as a final statement, what do you think is the biggest misconception about GenAI? And just one sentence to explain, and then I think we're out of time for this webinar. Boris, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that AI is just another new technology that is just like make our life a little bit different, like we already experienced Excel and Word in our work, and that will be just another technology like that. That will have some impact, but that will not substantially change our life and our professional life. I think this is misconception clearly, and I think the potential of this technology is huge. And the profession as we know it now in 5 to 10 years will be very different from what we know now. But the good news is that humans are very good at adapting. And then in 5 or 10 years, when you ask someone, are you amazed by AI and how it changed their life? They will say, it seems like it was always around and it will be fine. Not too much concerned about this misconception, but just, yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay. Bart, what's your biggest misconception?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions with generative AI is generative AI doesn't understand what you're saying. It's all statistics. I think that's the big misconception.
And Frank, what do you think is the biggest misconception?
One of the things is always, can GenAI really replace human intelligence? And the answer is up to this point, no. And there's a few tests you can do or perform to check if an AI is actually equal to human intelligence. So that's called artificial general intelligence. And one of them is the Turing test. There's another test, but one of the tests I really like is called the coffee test. And the coffee test is, can an AI walk into an office building, go find the coffee machine itself, grab a cup of coffee, take it and sit down at its workplace and start answering emails. So that's called the coffee test. And I think that answer is still no. And that's also why I think we will still have a job in 3 years.
Because
just to have a coffee at work.
Okay, well, we have 1 minute left. I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their knowledge with us. I think it's an extremely important topic to not be underestimated. Hopefully that's also clear from the panelists, but also recognizing that it cannot do everything for you already. They will still need some time. I would like to thank the audience for attending. I hope that you found this insightful and not be scared too much about GenAI. Talking from a personal perspective, it's always fun to ask certain things to ChatGPT and get the results and trying to validate them. So I can definitely encourage everybody to do that as well. So thanks for joining. I wish you a very pleasant rest of your day, and until next time. Bye, everybody.